Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time, a show appearing only here on Facebook Live. Jackson Mvunganyi, the host of Upfront, the viewers Upfront, is sitting in for Shaka Ssali. Jackson, welcome back again to Shaka Extra Time.
Thank you, Paul.
How are you?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm great, thank you. A warm welcome to you all. Our Facebook followers are watching us live here. Jackson today is going to be taking your questions, but before we get to the questions, let's maybe do a recap of what happened this week or last week. Let's start with Melania Trump's trip to Africa.
Right, Melania Trump is in Africa. She arrived, I believe, today in Ghana,
yes.
Where she'll be basically engaging in some sort of soft diplomacy, visiting projects that are mainly funded by USAID, which is, some must say, a little ironical given that the Trump administration has proposed deep cuts to the USAID projects, to USAID funding. She's currently in Ghana. We have our reporters on the ground, so we'll be getting some up-to-date information about some of the places she visits. We hear that she visited a clinic, a children's clinic, highlighting some issues of mortality, high mortality rates on the continent. From Ghana, I think she'll visit Kenya, Malawi, and then Kenya. Yeah. She'll be there for a week. So it's pretty good to see the First Lady, the U.S. First Lady on the continent. Also, given some of the remarks, some of the interesting remarks that came from the White House that I said where President Trump is supposed to have referred to Africa as shithole countries. So Melania Trump is doing some really good soft diplomacy on behalf of the administration and her husband.
In fairness to Trump, he has since corrected that statement and called Africa that Africa has some of the most beautiful places.
Right, indeed.
Yeah.
Last week, I think at Anger, at the UN General Assembly sidelines.
Yeah. What's the significance of this trip?
Well, I guess it's just to highlight the role of U.S. aid, U.S. foreign aid, and U.S. foreign policy on the continent of Africa, given that other players are coming in on the continent, including China. So it is good to see that Melania Trump is taking on the role of ambassador, I guess, U.S. ambassador to the continent. It's good to see that they're shifting some of the narrative that is of some of the stories that are happening on the continent. China has been featured prominently in the headlines, the China-Africa relationship, and I guess Melania coming in kind of divert some of that attention.
When you talk about the Trumps, this is not the first time the Trumps are in Africa. For example, the Trump's sons, Donald Jr. and Eric Jr. have been seen in Zimbabwe, for example, doing trophy hunting.
Right.
This is not the first time, and that I'm not sure if Trump himself has visited Trump, but it's remarkable that the wife at least made a trip there.
Indeed, indeed. And also we should note that she will be making a trip, I think, to an elephant sanctuary in Kenya, if I'm not mistaken. Given the history of her family engaging in trophy hunting on the continent, I believe this is a positive step.
Isn't that ironic?
It is ironic.
Let's talk more about some of the things that she's currently talking about. We know he's been pushing for her own to have a presidency in that White House, but obviously going to Africa, it's a big deal,
right? Especially
considering the fact that she's gone solo, not with her husband.
Right, right. She's been quite a very private first lady. Unlike other first ladies, or at least their predecessor. But this trip shines a global spotlight on her. So we'll see along the way how she handles herself, or how this trip's turned out to be. She hasn't, I think, spoken out to the media yet, but it'll be interesting to see some of her remarks on how the trip went.
Let's shift our focus back to Washington, D.C. Last week at the UN, we had all these presidents from Africa conclude their UNGA assembly. Most of them gave speeches, remarkable speeches. But what struck me particularly was the importance or how they underscored the role of fighting corruption on the continent. At least that's what I picked out. At least several leaders from the continent spoke about Africa in the context of fighting corruption. Your take?
My take is that, stop talking about it, just, do something about it. Corruption is such a big problem on the continent. As we have covered in the last two shows that we've done together here on Shaka Extra Time, we've talked about some of the leading stories on the continent in the past couple of weeks were corruption related. The son of Teodoro Obiang again being arrested in Brazil with $16 million in cash. The son of former President Jose dos Santos in Angola, and many other corruption scandals that are around the African continent. So it is interesting to see that when they come and take a global platform, a global stage like at ANGA, the UN General Assembly in New York, they talk about fighting corruption, but we need to see some concrete steps about what they're doing to fight corruption.
How big is that? How big a deal is that? How can they fight corruption when they are the same people aiding and abetting corruption in most cases?
Right. They, I guess, need some sort of self-searching about what their role is in some of these situations, some of these issues. Again, corruption is such a pervasive issue on the continent of Africa. Some of the people that are complicit in the corruption are the people also speaking out against it on these global platforms. It's okay to talk the talk, but also, we need to see people walking the walk.
When people talk a lot of corruption, a lot of people think it's just about stealing money or stealing or using public resources to benefit yourself or anybody with close proximity to you. But actually, corruption goes beyond just a mere stealing money.
Absolutely.
For example, let's say if you go to a hospital and there is no medicine and that doctor has stolen the medicine.
You're very right.
That's corruption.
You're very right, Paul.
But can you maybe break it down, put it in a very, let's say, not scientific way? Can you explain it?
There's no way I can break it down further than what you just said, Paul. If you are, you're a patient in Africa and you go to a public hospital and there's no medicine for you, if you trace where that what happened to the medication that was supposed to come to you, you will find that it was stolen by somebody in the supply chain, whether it's the doctors, whether it's the pharmacists, whether it's the somebody in the Ministry of Health, whether it is the Minister of Health. You remember a couple of years ago the situation in Uganda over a decade ago, I think, where the Minister of Health was complicit in the stealing of millions of dollars that was meant for HIV medication, I believe, money that was given as aid by Gavi, the Global Health Fund, I believe. It's been a while ago. I don't remember some of the details on that. But you coming from Uganda, so you remember that very succinctly. So yes, again, it's hard to distill it further than what you just said. You look at some of the very simple things. If you're a patient, you go to a hospital and there's no medicine for you in a public hospital, then somewhere in between that medicine leaving the depot where it was supposed to be or where it was being supposed to have been acquired by somebody in the Ministry of Health and it not getting to you, that if you trace that, there is corruption in there.
Let's talk about security. Security was also a major thing at this UNGA.
Yeah.
Let's talk about it, especially in light of Boko Haram in Nigeria, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and the ongoing conflict in South Sudan.
Indeed.
We seem to have come to terms with those issues. But how big of an impact has that insecurity had on those places, for example, in Nigeria, in Somalia, and in South Sudan?
Right, a lot of impact in terms of development. We see that many of these communities or societies are held back because of the violence that occurs, as we've seen in South Sudan, a country that is the newest country in Africa, the youngest country in the world. 2 years into its establishment, it starts a civil war that has been ongoing for the last how many years? 5 years now, over 5 years. Millions of people dead, millions of people I don't know whether it's million people dead, but I know millions of people displaced. There's refugees in Uganda and around, hundreds of thousands dead. A peace agreement that doesn't look like it's going to work, given that some of the major players are kind of still very mistrustful of each other.
Some people refer them to as peace jobs.
Right. But yeah, conflict, war, any type of situation that destabilizes society has a huge impact on its ability to develop and to grow and to prosper.
Before we switch to another topic, let's first take a comment from Ruth Adisu in Addis Ababa. She says, are female politicians are susceptible to corruption as males?
Well, I think, corruption knows no sex, I think the reason why we see
sex or
many...
gender?
Gender, sorry. The reason why we see a lot of men as complicit in some of the corruption scandals is because many of the leadership on the continent the continent is male-dominated, and so most of the scandals that we read about regarding corruption involve a man or a male leader, but it does not mean that women are less complicit in the corruption. I don't think that women, by any measure, are less corrupt. I think it's something that is societal. When you look at places where, like for example, Nigeria, we remember a story about the former minister of oil, I believe, who was said to have built she was female. She built a $1 million mansion from the resources that belong to Nigerians, and happy independence anniversary to Nigeria. By the way, they celebrated their independence anniversary yesterday. So happy independence anniversary to Nigerians, and hopefully that
58 years of independence.
Right, and whenever we talk about Nigeria, some of the things that come to mind are corruption. It has been said one of the most corrupt places on the continent. But that story of that female minister who was caught with millions of dollars that belong to the public, that is the story that comes to mind when we talk about corruption and female leaders.
In fact, I can add that in Zambia, as of 2 weeks ago, a female cabinet minister was fired for corruption allegations.
Oh, wow.
The British government cut off aid, and I think several other European countries cut off aid to Zambia as a result of some investigation that led to millions of dollars are being swindled by quote unquote a female minister. Corruption
knows no gender.
So somebody, another interesting Facebook comment here. Let's go to Guy Fuleli Didia from Bujumbura, who he says, we haven't talked about this, but maybe let me put this in context. Do you think the African Union should have supported Rwanda against the U.S. used cloth imports? This is something that hasn't gotten enough publicity, but there was talk about it. Rwanda stood up to a bully, United States, in this particular case, about imported or used clothes. A lot of people in Africa used cloth, but Rwanda for the first time stood up to the bully, United States. Your take on that?
All right. Okay, so I wouldn't say Rwanda stood up to the bully, referring to the U.S. I think Rwanda decided to. I think they were in some sort of agreement in the East African. Many of those East African countries had agreed that they won't let used clothes come into their markets. But there was a lot of pressure coming from the U.S. And many of them acquiesced. Rwanda said no. And the question is that should the African Union have supported Rwanda against, this situation. Yes, they should have. Rwanda is a member state of the African Union. The African Union should have stood up for their member state and spoken up about it. It is true that many of the countries in this area, their textile industries suffer because of used clothes coming in and accessing or competing with local textile industries. Rwanda is one of the few countries that say we don't want that to happen anymore. And yeah, Rwanda would have loved to see some support coming from the African Union and other countries that they had agreements with, including Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, members of the East Africa community.
But Jackson, how many people in Rwanda can afford to buy brand new clothes?
Yeah, but depending on where they come from. It's like
President Kagame is doing this for political reasons. There are a lot of millions of people who can't afford to buy brand new stuff.
I beg to disagree. Yeah, It depends on which new clothes and where the clothes are coming from.
I mean, you're talking about everybody being like in the middle class here. We are talking about a lot of poor people in Rwanda who depend on these second-hand used clothes.
If you go to Rwanda, which I was last year, you can buy a shirt for the same amount of money you buy, like an original, shirt made in Rwanda, on the same amount of money you buy a used shirt. Okay, so it depends on where the shirt is coming from, the quality of the shirt. There are all these different, I guess, factors in play when you talk about pricing of clothes. But it is, I don't think this was a political move on Rwanda's side or President Kagame's side to try and act tough on the international stage. I believe this was something that was a pragmatic. Economic move on their side. I
mean, I can understand him trying to develop and improve the home industry by not allowing in these imports. Right. But at the same time,
which is the overriding
but at the same time, I can make an argument and say he's being too elitist.
How is he being elitist when he doesn't want
I mean, you have millions of people who depend on this stuff. That's a fact.
I guess we'll agree to disagree. All right, next.
Okay, let's move on. Actually, it looks like we're having a lot of questions on corruption.
Yeah.
Before we do that, let's maybe you are watching Shaka Extra Time. Shaka Ssali is off. Jackson Mvunganyi is filling in for Shaka Ssali. Shaka will be back maybe in a week or so. But in the meantime, there is another question here. About corruption. Alexander wants to know if corruption is generic.
No, it's not. It's not. Corruption is not genetic. I can't even say anything more than that.
Okay, let's go to Liberia again. Corruption. He wants you to talk about corruption in Liberia.
Right.
So we recently talked about money being swindled. Over $100 million just disappeared between the airport and the capital city, Monrovia. Somebody somewhere managed to steal over $100 million of printed money.
Right. So corruption in this case, as in all cases, is a failure of institutions to maintain checks on the resources of a nation. If Liberia, for example, the central bank, which had ordered for the banknotes to be printed in Sweden, if there were institutions that were strong enough to follow the money from point A, from where it was printed, to where it's supposed to go in the central bank vault. If they had strong institutions, then we wouldn't have had a situation where they lost 5% of their GDP. Okay, so it's not in the DNA of Africans to be corrupt.
Let's talk about something else. Let's talk about elections in Cameroon.
Yeah.
We have elections coming up this weekend. Paul Biya, who has been in power since 1982, he's again running very strong. He's likely to win, probably with maybe a 99% margin. What do you make of these elections? Are these really elections? Why subject people to these kinds of periodic elections when there's not going to be change?
Shaka Ssali likes to call them selections and not elections. Yeah. So, you know, just to quote him, it is sad to see that, you know, Cameroon, potentially also one of the richest countries on the continent, has been under the leadership of the same man since 1982. Mm-hmm. He is going to win, like you said, very likely to win because one opponents or the opposition says that he always rigs the elections. President Biya is never really in that country. He spends most of his time in Switzerland or other places around the world. So the question is, how is he able to get people to vote for him if he's never in the country in the first place? So it tells you that, again, you know, a lack of strong institutions like an electoral commission that would safeguard the voices of Cameroonians as they go into these elections. It's already a foregone conclusion that Paul Biya is going to win. Just the fact that we know that it's a foregone conclusion is sad. You know, they have some sort of conflict happening in, I think it's the eastern part of...
no, the separatists. They want to create their own state.
Right.
Ambazonia.
Ambazonia, yeah. Right. But that they are going into an election when part of their country is in some form of conflict is also a situation that it's an issue that we should look into.
Jackson, let's not forget that Paul Biya in 2008, just like all the other East African leaders, with the exception of maybe Tanzania and Kenya, amended their constitutions to see their leaders through another term. And Paul Biya managed to do that in 2008. But let me also add that it actually reminds me of a quote, my favorite quote, by Joseph Stalin, that it doesn't matter how many people show up to vote, but what matters is that that person who counts the vote.
Right.
And in this particular case, it could not be true.
It doesn't matter who votes, it matters who counts the vote. You're right. You're right. And so I guess in this situation, if it will depend on who is
counting the vote,
who counts the votes, who is in the electoral commission, how strong the electoral commission is, how independent it is. I think we need to see in Africa electoral commissions that are independent of the ruling party or independent of the executive, so that people are sure that are confident that when the votes are being counted, that the president or the ruling party is not coming in to kind of mess around with the votes and the tallies of the of the numbers of the people. So we need, as we talk about corruption and leadership, I think one of the things that people need to, on the continent, mostly young people, need to call out for is for independent electoral commissions.
But all these countries that we are talking about often say that they have independent electoral commissions, that at the end of the day, those elections reflect the will of the people.
Right. But look at who appoints the electoral commission. If it's somebody that is appointed by the president or the party in power, then there's a little bit of a question on how independent they are.
It looks like you have some funds here. Let's go to Mukwanda Emmanuel Prince. Banning second-hand clothes from Western countries was a good time for Rwandese to think big. To think big. And we now have textile industries in the country, and we do enjoy the prices, as Jackson says.
Absolutely. I agree with you. Thank you for agreeing with me. Mwanda. Okay. Where's Mwanda from? Where does he say he's from?
I think he doesn't say where he's from. Right. Yeah. Okay, I think let's go back to Cameroon. You talked about the unrest. You have the Francophone and the English-speaking Cameroon. These two have been at loggerheads. The English-speaking want to separate from the French-speaking, so they create their own state called Ambazonia.
Right.
Ambazonia. But there's been a lot of tension leading to this election. I wonder what could be done to stop these guys from wanting to secede?
Well, I think their main worry or their main complaint is that they don't feel represented in the decision making of the country. For example, one of the issues that led to the uprising about 2016 was that the central government in what was the capital, Yaoundé, had sent administrators to these regions who were who were French speaking in an English speaking region. And so they say historically there have been there have been this type of policies from Yaoundé, from President Biya's administration that have not really benefited that region, and so they say maybe it's time we broke apart and formed our own government. I agree that they should, but that's something that I don't feel like that they really necessarily have to separate to be able to solve those issues. They can go to vote, elect a new leader in Cameroon, engage your people, mobilize your people, tell them to go to the polls, and hopefully that you can elect a new leader so that you can have your voice represented on national policy making platforms.
Still on this issue of secession, we've seen some examples. For example, South Sudan seceded from Sudan in 2010. But that example has really not materialized. Since they seceded from Sudan, they've been having conflict over leaders killing each other, leaders killing their own people. Should we be advocating for the English-speaking Cameroonians to really form their own country?
I think South Sudan is a little different, but in general, I don't think secession is a solution in many of these places where they're clamoring for it.
Especially when other countries are trying to come together to form a common front.
Absolutely. I think we should be trying to come together, opening borders, strength is in numbers. And so when we start to balkanize the continent and, form, countries based on religion or tribe or group, then our people are the ones that lose. Let's get some China story questions in there.
Unfortunately, we are running out of time. Tomorrow on Straight Talk Africa, we'll be talking about corruption. Shaka Ssali is still out, but guest host Vincent Makori will be talking about corruption. As we spoke about earlier in the opening of this show, we talked about corruption. There are several African leaders who were in town who talked about corruption, and I think Vincent will be maybe explaining more. Maybe very briefly, Jackson, what do you think should be done? Somebody wants us to talk about Nigeria, especially now that they just celebrated their 58th independence anniversary. How about corruption? The issue of corruption is still a big deal over there.
You're right. Corruption is still an issue in Nigeria. We've seen some efforts in this administration, but it's still a long way to go. Corruption has been pervasive in that country for many years, for generations. Some of the steps taken by the current administration of Buhari have been positive, but I think there's still more to be done.
How about those people who say that he's been slow in acting?
I don't know how slow he has been. Again, something that has been, in the country for generations is not something is not an issue you can deal with in just 4 years in office. So some major steps. I've had some really good things about some of the steps taken by Buhari in fighting corruption in Nigeria.
Unfortunately, Jackson, we have to stop there. It's been a pleasure hosting you again on Shaka Extra Time. For those of you who are interested in watching Jackson's show, Upfront, every Wednesday.
Yes, every Wednesday, 17:30 UTC on Voice of America.
The biggest spending